Thank you all for calling in. We're now going to bring to the Center for American Progress. They're hosting special envoy Todd Stern, the top U.S. climate diplomat, and its chief negotiator, to get his insights into the negotiating on the ground, the outcome of the conference, and what the agreement means for the future of U.S. and international efforts to combat climate change. Live here on C-SPAN.
Executive Vice President of External Affairs, and I am just thrilled to see all of you for this fantastic conversation. For years, the science has been clear for anyone who was willing to pay attention to it. Unchecked, climate change poses major challenges to our society and the natural world, threatening the world's cities and infrastructure, food security, public health, and the survival of countless species. Despite this very real and present danger, our Congress has stood by and done almost nothing. Since 2011, the only legislation that Congress has considered has been to stop action on climate change, promote highly polluting sources of energy, block funding on research, and even prevent the State Department from working with other countries on solutions. Fortunately, none of these bad ideas have become law. But while Congress dithered, President Obama got to work. In June 2013, the President announced his Climate Action Plan, and in the 2.5 years since, we've seen bold and unprecedented leadership from the administration on the issue of climate change. They have taken steps to enhance efficiency, boost renewables, curb tailpipe emissions, and cut pollution from our power sector. As impressive as these accomplishments are, and they certainly are, we've also known that climate change is not a problem that can be solved by the United States alone. We can lead, but others must follow. That's why, since 2009, the State Department has persistently and resolutely toiled to build consensus toward a global agreement on climate change. That work was not done in isolation. Over the past year, the French demonstrated remarkable diplomatic skills, and the Chinese and Indians stepped up to the plate. The private sector, civil society, and officials from every government around the world worked hard, and it paid off. On Saturday, 195 countries came together in the spirit of cooperation and solidarity around an historic climate agreement that will reduce carbon pollution and make the world safer for our children and grandchildren. The Paris Agreement has been characterized as ambitious, flexible, transparent. The world is already transitioning to greater clean energy use. This agreement establishes a strong foundation for that action that will accelerate the shift to a clean energy economy for the world. As the administration has worked toward this achievement, the Center for American Progress has been right there, thinking through the problems, identifying solutions, and focusing the public's attention. Our work on the Green Climate Fund identified the tremendous opportunity the fund creates and how to get it off the ground. Our work on the legal form of the agreement is an excellent primer for those hoping to understand what types of international agreements need to be considered by the Senate and which ones don't. Our work on loss and damage lit a path for how this important issue could be resolved. And throughout the run-up to Paris, we were always thinking, how do we increase the ambition? So many people from so many countries deserve recognition for the work that made this agreement possible. But there is one man who has been the face of the United States to the world on climate change since 2009. And no one in the United States deserves more credit than he does. Todd Stern's career boasts an impressive list of accomplishments, from Harvard Law School to senior White House negotiator at the Kyoto and Buenos Aires climate negotiations, to senior roles at Treasury and the Senate Judiciary Committee, not to mention his time here at the Center for American Progress as a senior fellow. Todd is the lead U.S. negotiator, and we are so very pleased and honored to welcome here, back to CAP, for his first appearance after the Paris Agreement, for a conversation with CAP Senior Fellow Peter Ogden. Please, Todd Stern, welcome to the stage, and Pete Ogden, please join them.
side do you want?
Whatever we did this way last time. Great. Well, thanks so much for that introduction, and it's wonderful to have you here today, Todd.
Thanks very much, Pete. Thanks to CAPS, my old home. There was a time in Washington where everybody who was a Democrat had worked at one time or another for either John or Tony Podesta, and I actually worked for both of them. But I also want to thank everybody at CAP and everybody else who's involved and has been involved and engaged in the NGO world or in some other aspect of working on and pressing on action on climate change, because I think that there was a huge amount of momentum around the world this year coming from NGOs in the U.S. And in Europe and around the world, coming from business. The French were really good at developing what they called a Pillar 4 for the Paris event, that channel that kind of intense interest and activism and momentum. It was a really very different story if I think all the way back to Kyoto. The business was basically lined up hard against action, and so all of that I think really played a part. So I start with a thank you to all of you who have been engaged, and glad to be here.
Great. Well, maybe a good place to start then would be to get your kind of perspective on what the key elements of the Paris Agreement are.
Yeah. And
then we can dig into that and then talk a little bit about what it was like on the ground for the last couple of weeks.
Right. Well, I think that we have in fact a major historic agreement that is built on a number of elements. First of all, it's universal and lasting. So it's sort of the not Kyoto. It's an agreement whose expectations and requirements and so forth apply to everybody. So we tried the Kyoto model. The Kyoto model was all obligations aimed at developed countries, and developing countries not really having to do anything, and that failed as a matter of politics, but it also fails as a matter of being able to substantively deal with the problem. So universal and lasting. It sets us on a path of high ambition, built on the so-called INDCs, the targets that have already that 186 countries had put forward before the Paris COP even started. There are 5-year cycles built into the agreement, so countries are going to have to ratchet up those targets at every 5 years, either on the basis that they put in a new target, or if they're in the middle of a longer target period of 10 years, they have to review and decide whether to increase at that time in light of science and technology and so forth, or at least put forward a communication saying that they've looked and they're going to keep and they're just going to stay where they are for that period. But 5-year ratchets, which we all thought were really critical. There are strong goals in the agreement, both a goal of keeping temperature rise to well below 2 degrees, and even trying to pursue efforts to get to hold the increase to 1.5, as well as essentially carbon neutrality or climate neutrality in the course of this century. So strong ambition. Third, a strong new transparency regime that we think is critical. This piece of the agreement is legally binding, and it applies to everybody, and it's built on countries having to do inventories, having to report on the progress they're making toward their targets, being subject to expert review and peer review. All of those things built into an overall transparency system, again, that applies to both developed and developing countries, so really important. It enhances the focus more than has ever happened before on adaptation, with a particular emphasis on both national planning, international cooperation, support from richer countries to poorer countries, and so forth. And then I guess we could have started here, because this is quite fundamental to the agreement itself. The architecture of the climate regime has changed. The core here is that, of course, there has to be differentiation in the agreement, but we have really insisted and pushed for years since you were running around at the State Department, Pete, for a differentiation regime that is built on essentially a forward-looking rather than backward-looking approach, with nationally determined activity based on capacity and circumstances at the core of it. So rather than saying every country that is in this category, it's set up in 1992, is only expected to do X, and developed countries are expected to do Y, even if those countries are China or Korea or Singapore or the OECD countries that are now in that category and so forth. That doesn't make any sense, and so instead we've essentially changed the architecture. And then there are provisions on financial assistance and technical assistance, which again we think are strong and balanced, and those are the key elements.
Wait, one of the things you mentioned at the very end, which is one of the threads that's been spun way back starting in 2009, is how to move towards an arrangement in which the major economies are also not hung up or see an obstacle in setting a low carbon path, but one which they think can be consistent with their own development priorities.
Right.
Do you feel like something what's changed between 2009, when that was so hard to see and for countries to want to embrace, to today, when not only do they set INDCs now, but they've agreed to a system of ratcheting them in perpetuity? I mean, what do you think changed?
So, I think it's a really good question, and it's going to be. This is a question the answer to which will evolve with more reflection and more kind of review of what's actually happened. But I think I'd start the answer by saying that Copenhagen, which is widely regarded as a massive failure, and it was definitely chaotic, and it definitely failed in certain respects, actually did very important things. I mean, Copenhagen was the first time where so look, we come in, President gets elected, and Secretary Clinton comes into the State Department, and I come in with her, and we're catching a negotiation that's right in the middle, because that negotiation was launched in Bali in 2007, so it was a 2-year negotiation, and we're jumping onto a moving train, and that moving train is basically still premised on the notion that you were going to fundamentally have a real fundamental difference between the kinds of things that developed countries would do and the kinds of things that developing countries would do. And one side was going to be legally binding and economy-wide absolute reductions, et cetera, and the other sort of do what you can, as you can. And we came in with, I've been through the wars in Kyoto and Buenos Aires the year after that. So I had not been working on climate continually, but I had been through those wars. I had continued to be involved in my capacity at CAP, as I was also at that point practicing law. And a great many countries were just not prepared to have that basic kind of understanding that they thought that they had agreed to in Bali, where you were still going to have a Kyoto-like separation. Countries were not prepared for that to change. So we came in and said, at that time, we are not going to do a legally binding agreement just for the developed countries. And if we'll consider a legally binding agreement if it's sort of set up the right way, but not for just one side, not for us with leaving China and all the others out. So that roiled the waters a lot. The Danes, who played a great hand all the way up until the last couple of months where they made some mistakes, figured out pretty early on that this just was not going to be the treaty that people were expecting, because you weren't going to be able to get that. And so they started to convert this whole notion quietly and bit by bit, and in a way that their Prime Minister first sort of started to talk about publicly at UNCA. This would have to be an agreement that actually was politically binding but not legally binding, and where at least the big players all did something. And that actually happened in the Copenhagen Accord, but there was, not without a lot of broken crockery. There was huge upset, huge kind of violent reaction against being yanked out of the old system. So, and that just started it. The old system wasn't kind of definitively surpassed at that point. But that started it, and I think that. So then you sort of have years of negotiations go by. The mandate for this one was reached in Durban, and there were two critical things in the Durban mandate. One was that the agreement was going to be applicable to all, so they took that plunge that everybody was going to be in a way even well beyond what happened in Copenhagen. But at the same time, they got language in there that they felt protected them. It was going to be under the convention. It was going to be sort of protected by the classic principles of common but differentiated responsibilities and so forth. Anyway, I think those things were quite critical. And then, if you look at this agreement, there are still sort of protections in terms of the way they would look at it. We reached an important one-line fix in the famous China joint announcement with China in 2014, where we took that common but differentiated responsibilities sentence, which doesn't automatically mean this, but it is traditionally read by countries to be these two categories, and we added a few words in a negotiation that was a part of that short statement, which changed the formulation a little bit to make it more forward-looking, with more of a sense of evolution, and that line that then got dropped into the Lima negotiation last year. So it was a kind of bit by bit, people getting more acclimated, and we were just quite insistent about this for a long time, and people knew that I think that there would not be an agreement with the United States unless we moved past that old architecture.
And you mentioned that one of the challenges was trying to figure out the right legal form that would allow you to secure those gains. Maybe we can talk a little bit about the diplomacy on the ground, but just as a general matter, one of the issues that arose at the very end was a question of some language in the text and the question of what it would mean for the overall legal architecture of the agreement.
Right.
Could you speak a little bit to that?
Sure.
And what that,
Well, that was
how you felt when you saw the text and so
yeah.
forth.
So the last draft of the text that we were supposed to be the last iteration, I guess, came out around 1:30 on Saturday, and it comes online to everybody's computers, and we all start printing it out. And I started reading it right away, and I was actually the one who saw in Article 4, Paragraph 4, this word "shall" that wasn't supposed to be there. It was supposed to be a "should," but it said "shall," and it was a paragraph that we had worked on very carefully, and we had worked on in concert with the French. We had worked it through, sort of shared the language and had agreement with the Chinese, and all previous drafts ahead in that pivotal word had always been the same. And the word matters because basically "shall" means legally binding and "should" means not legally binding in the way the drafting of international agreements goes. So somehow or other, a gremlin got into the French typewriters and computers, and the word popped out. It is a very interesting mystery as to what happened, because somebody somewhere in the French or Secretariat system decided to do that, because you don't autocorrect from "should" to "shall." But Fabius, Laurent Fabius, the president of the negotiations, and his key drafters, who we were very close to, didn't know anything about it. I mean, I actually saw the word. Secretary Kerry was there. We called Fabius right away. He had no idea that it had happened. None of the key drafting people knew it had happened, but somebody somewhere changed it, and we couldn't actually go forward, because that would have made this whole agreement legally binding for the United States, and that, for reasons that are probably obvious, that wouldn't have been so useful for us. So, but it was a genuine mistake, and I think the Chinese knew this, and the French knew it, and but on the floor, and I wouldn't say that I was sort of deeply worried, but I was worried. But there was at that point such a sense in the room, and there had been an earlier gathering in the plenary right an hour before the text had come out. But there was such a broad feeling among both developed and developing countries that this was happening now. We had sort of crossed the Rubicon. It was going to happen, and I kind of couldn't imagine it would actually all fall apart over this. But still, there's a history of tremendous amount of distrust and skepticism in these negotiations. And so the notion that everybody sort of thought, oh well, it's a mistake, of course, as opposed to what did the U.S. do? What did they fix? It's not that easy. You've sort of got to get over that, and then. Even the way these negotiations. This is a hardball environment. So even for people in many countries who are difficult, there are a fair number of difficult countries. It may come as a shock to you, but there are. And so for some of those negotiators, whether it was a mistake or not a mistake, it was there. It was an opportunity. Yep. So okay, you want me to agree to let this be fixed? What am I going to get? And that would have unraveled the whole thing because you wouldn't have been able to stop that. So there was 90 minutes of a lot of hustling around diplomacy, right on the floor in the back rooms, right around the the French and around the big podium area to fix that. And ultimately we did, and then the French handled it well. There's a lot of talking to a lot of people to explain what happened and to quiet things down and to get the Bolivians to go talk to the Nicaraguans and the Chinese to go talk to the South Africans. There's a lot of calming that had to be done.
You said at the end there again, and a couple times earlier, the French sort of handled that moment well. It sounds like they handled a lot of moments well in the previous 2 weeks. I think they've kind of got a...
They did.
For people, I think it's one thing to say it was diplomatically skillful, but that word can sort of be abstract to people. And what does it mean to be... are there moments when you thought, this was really well played. The French they're doing this right. This was smart. Where you sort of were able to, in a more concrete way that people can kind of wrap their heads around.
Yeah. Well, I think that they certainly played that moment quite well, and once there was enough discussions had gone on and the proceedings resumed. They had a guy from the Secretariat who's been there for a long time and who is just the picture of a bureaucrat. Just get up and read through like 10 little corrections. There was supposed to be a comma here. There's a this, that, and he just read through all of these things at like 90 miles an hour, including, and in paragraph 4.4, just the opening line says, and just read the way it was supposed to be. Never said. It says shall, now we change it to should. And it just went really quickly and then went to Fabius, sort of seeing broad support in the room, bang, and the whole thing was over before anybody kind of knew it, which was good. I think that throughout throughout the 2 weeks, but also throughout the year, I think that they did a good job in I'll just focus on the 2 weeks in Paris. They did a good job in having the process feel open and inclusive and giving countries a sense that everybody was getting an opportunity to be heard. And sometimes you have sessions that feel like they are a big waste of time. But there's a purpose to them. There were 2 sessions on the Wednesday and Thursday night of the second week that went on for hours late in the night, where there was a room with a sort of gigantic square table, probably 85 countries around it, and countries were just kind of like giving speeches, and you're sort of sitting there thinking, we've got things to do, we've got provisions that's left to get worked out, and like, what are we doing? This is a waste of time. But I think it actually wasn't a waste of time. I think it was I think it was actually smart to do, to give people that sense of being included. They spent the entire day on Friday having groups, because there's many different groupings in you have the islands and the Africans and the least developed countries and this, that, and the other. There's like 15 different groups of countries. And each coming in to sit with Fabius to say this is what they were concerned about, and to kind of knock that back and forth a little bit. And I think that probably took them 10 hours. I mean, it was a long day. But again, it first of all, it was just, in that case, there's an important substance that happens, because they learn where there's really problems that still have to get worked out. But they also give people a chance to be heard. So this is an art, not a science, managing these kinds of negotiations, and it's an odd kind of international body, the UNFCCC, because and process, because there is a new COP, a Conference of the Parties meeting, at the end of every year, and every year it's in a different place. So now the French know how to do it now, but they're not doing it anymore.
Right.
Like the Mexicans were great in 2010, and they kind of mastered it, but then they were done. It's like you do it for 1 year and you're done, and then somebody else comes in and they don't have a clue what they're doing, and so there's that kind of built-in oddity in the way this process works.
I mean, the other thing that'd be interesting to hear about is not just the diplomatic success of the French and how they achieved it, but that of the United States. I mean, this was a COP in which you were there for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
President Obama was there for several days. Secretary Kerry was there for much of the 2 weeks. There was a huge amount of on-the-ground activity, also leading up to that moment over the last several years.
Yeah.
So what was the sort of theory of the case here?
That's
in Paris.
That's the right question. I mean, I should go back a little bit in time, because not to toot our own horn, but there's an awful lot of this agreement reflects the theory of the case that we had from the beginning. And so go back to Durban 2011 in December, 4 years ago, and we came out of that conference with this new mandate to do, as I said before, a new agreement, legal in some form, but not clear what the legal form would be, and applicable to all, and sort of covering various areas. And we figured out, and to me it wasn't very complicated to figure out, but it was also not the case that other countries had gotten there right away. So we figured out pretty much right away that the only way to do this kind of agreement would be to have a bottom-up structure in which countries nationally determine what their commitments were going to be, as opposed to the kind of negotiation that occurred in Kyoto, which, because it was very limited in terms of the countries covered, it was developed countries, and having been there, I can tell you that the negotiation fundamentally was a three-cornered negotiation between the U.S., Japan, and the EU, and about what our targets were going to be. And there were, there's some other developed countries on the sides of that, but that was the core of it. And it was a real negotiation about countries agreeing to each other's targets. You couldn't have targets and timetables. You couldn't have that kind of negotiation if you could have 195 countries, including all the developing countries, part of it. So you had to have a bottom-up structure, which turned into, it was originally nationally determined commitments, and then it turned into nationally determined contributions for reasons not worth spending time on. And then we had the additional idea, so you have to start that way, but you also don't want to let countries off the hook easy. Right, so you want to put as much kind of salutary pressure as you can on countries to do their best. So we came up with the idea of saying let's have a first round, like an intended nationally determined contribution that would go in 6 or 9 months before the end, so that countries would have to be exposed to the sunlight. I have to put my target down, and guys like you and other NGOs and the press and think tanks and analytic bodies in other countries are all going to look and say, kind of thumbs up, thumbs down, that's pretty good, that stinks, that's whatever, right? So you're going to have pressure put on countries, reputational pressure, but most countries care about that. The EU favored an actually more involved assessment process to determine whether the proposed targets were good enough. We didn't oppose that in the sense that we could have done that for our own purposes, but we knew that wouldn't fly. There's like no way that developing countries were going to put up with that. So we just thought the sunlight in and of itself would help drive. And then we had a pretty clear idea in our mind about the legal nature that the agreement, legal form the agreement would have to take. Usefully, and actually not through any connivance on our part, just because they were useful self-starters, New Zealand put forward a proposal that was very that was very constructive from our point of view. It was an approach for the legal form of the agreement, which basically said this should be a hybrid. It should have legally binding commitments to put forward your target and to have all of the elements of transparency and accountability legally binding and rules legally binding, but not the target itself. And that was, from our point of view, a very useful construct, because it would still be a legal agreement, but a very important part of it wouldn't be. So that also was something that we started to work on and socialize, which really didn't get settled all the way to Paris, although it was one of those things that didn't get settled because countries, it's one of those things where everybody knows where it's going to end, but the EU and others didn't want to quite say so until the end. But transparency was going to be key. You have all of these nationally determined targets. It's great, but how do you know countries are going to actually do what they say? I've been asked any number of times over the last few days. Well, but are there penalties? Is it punitive? Is it binding in that sense? The answer is no, because you can't possibly get agreement for that, at least at this stage. So legally binding, but not in a punitive way. And all of those elements are elements that that form the kind of core architecture of this agreement. And and again, the notion that we, as I said before, that we were going to have differentiation. It's completely unfair to think that everybody's supposed to do the same thing. And we are always have been completely supportive of the notion that developing countries should have the capacity to act in this area, but in a way that preserves their imperatives of development and growth and poverty eradication and all of that. So all of those were sort of the key building blocks of this thing, and which we had mapped out pretty much from the beginning. And we have this forum that we started called the Major Economies Forum. It interestingly was a forerunner of it was started by President Bush. It was the Major Economies meeting. I don't actually know what the real story was behind their setting that up. I always sort of thought it was, they were not focused, as you might remember, on getting an international agreement done in the Bush administration. But I think they had sort of undergone quite a lot of criticism for having pulled out of Kyoto, and I think at some point along the way they wanted to start to put a more positive face on activities in the climate arena, and they anyway put together this group of 17 countries, developed and developing, and we didn't decide to change so it's more or less a G20 minus about 3. So we took that group, we gave it a slightly new name, and we gave it a new mission, which was to really try to help facilitate the negotiations as well as a couple of other things. And we used that. It's always been a tremendously useful body, which has met anywhere from 3 to 6 times a year, and it's a place where, so speaking of CAP, I actually wrote an article for CAP in the interregnum between the Democratic administrations that called for the creation of an E8, I called it at that point, which was the eight counted Europe as one, so it's not that different from the 17 that ended up in the Major Economies Forum. But the notion was you need to have a place where, having gone through Kyoto and Buenos Aires, as I said, realizing that circus is not a place you can have actual, real, intimate, serious conversations about policy, that we needed to create that at a ministerial level, get together often, and have trust and sort of intimacy built up between countries over time, and have it be a place where you could socialize ideas, but not make decisions, not negotiate, but socialize ideas, which, I mean, you were at a number of them, and I think it really, really had that effect. So anyway, I'm rambling too long.
No, and yet, in Paris itself, you found the need for a new coalition, which has since been dubbed the Ambition Coalition.
So I'll give you a little bit of the tactics closer in. So I was sort of giving you the broader strategy of what the thing was going to need to look like, but we kind of do the patient diplomacy all the time, do the major economies meetings. My team goes 3 or 4 times a year to the formal sessions of 195 countries, working on the agreement. This year, we came into the year with about a 90-page compilation text, which wasn't really a text of an agreement. It was like everything but the kitchen sink thrown in by countries who wanted to make sure that their own pet ideas were included. So then that all gets put together, and you've got this huge, ungainly thing. And it didn't change that much over the year. So there were 4 meetings at the sub-ministerial level, the negotiator level, like one notch below me, and the first meeting didn't really change that text very much. The second meeting, they got it from about 90 to 85 pages, right? And then the third one, still, it was still in this, unmanageable form. And then that was early September. And then the last meeting of the so-called formal meeting of the negotiators took place October 19th to 23rd, and the co-chairs of the negotiations, not the French, but one guy from the U.S., one guy from Algeria, at that point decided to go to make the big move from this big sort of ungainly mass to a stripped down, clear, coherently organized, and very short text, which was about 10 pages for the agreement and another 10 pages for the accompanying decision. And either they decided or they were pushed in this direction by the French. I'm not sure, but there were places where they just made a choice among options, and they made that choice too early in the process. You might think, well, October's getting to be pretty late, but not in this process. The French also had a hope early on that by October it was all going to be wrapped up and we would go and have a celebration in Paris and for the actual meeting. And any of us old dogs who'd been through this a number of times knew that was wildly unrealistic, because although there are other negotiations that work that way. There were 2 other international negotiations this year, that one for financing for development and the other the post-2015, and both of which basically wrapped up a month or so early. But the climate doesn't work that way. So they go in with this stripped down text, and there's an uproar in the meeting in October. And the G77 leadership, which is this ambassador from South Africa, really pulled together the hardliners and then pulled together the whole G77 meeting, all the developing countries. And even the progressive voices among the developing countries were pretty much silenced. So you had this really roiling, angry, acrimonious meeting just a month before Paris, basically. And so the 2 weeks after that, there was a session of about 60, maybe 75 countries, which is something that happens every year, called the pre-COP. So it's a meeting of ministers. This was bigger than usual. It's usually about 40 countries, but chaired by the French. And I went to that meeting very much, because of the experience of October, very much focused on rekindling a coalition that the EU had really pulled together at the time of Durban in order to get the Durban mandate done. The EU worked a lot with the islands and the least developing countries who have interests and perspectives that often are different from China, India, Brazil, and so forth. And so I went into the pre-COP, and I went a few days early even, so they had more time for meetings, very much with a mission to get that coalition restarted and to put the U.S. firmly in that coalition where we had always sort of been on the margins, and to show flexibility in certain areas that different from what we had done all year, to sort of try to get that group of countries more sort of revive them and get them more sort of open and synced up with the U.S. as well as the EU. And I think that was I think we did that pretty successfully over that sort of 5 or 6 days in Paris of the pre-COP. And then that gave rise to what became known as the High Ambition Coalition in Paris, which was, I think, actually enormously important tactically. And there was various meetings along the way in the first week, but there was then a dinner Sunday night, the 6th, in Paris that was hosted by sort of a combination of the UK and the leader from one of the islands, of the Marshall Islands. Their minister was very good, and it was maybe 30 countries at this dinner, including us. And then there was very close kind of ongoing collaboration and interaction of this coalition in the days that followed, including, I forget now if it was Wednesday or Thursday, but a press conference where I think 8 or 9 of us were up on the stage, including the U.S. for the first time, and the press conference room was completely packed. I mean, this was already big news, and I think it had a big impact. There was a remarkable moment on the midday plenary on Saturday when we were called in by Fabius. The text wasn't quite ready, but he was kind of walking through what was going to happen that day and gave a pretty strong speech himself. But there was basically a march from the meeting room in the UK delegation all the way, and this was a big center, so this was like a long way. It wasn't like from here to there. And it just sort of swelled, and there were like a zillion cameras, and people were cheering, and it was an amazing moment. And I think it was, it was both a moving moment, but I also think it was a tactically important message to send to the whole body.
Yeah, I think it's undoubtedly one of the defining moments visually that will be remembered and associated with the success of the COP.
Yeah.
And I know that we could continue to unpack what happened for a long time.
Yeah.
I want to just use our few minutes remaining to talk a little bit about maybe what's to come. And I know you probably have not had a lot of time to think about this.
That's true.
But as you said, one of the successes of Paris was because of the activity of civil society, of private sector. They were all had a big hand in this victory. So as people start to think about 2017 and beyond, not to sort of put you on the spot and say these are the only 3 things to focus on.
Yeah.
But what kind of questions do you still think could benefit from more thought and investigation? As we kind of move forward and try to make the most of this agreement.
Yeah, well, so I guess the first thing is that there are going to be a number of areas where further work, guidelines or whatever will need to be put in place to implement or to provide more detail to things that were agreed to. So a perfect example of this is the whole transparency regime. We had a one real priority which was to not allow the effort, which was an actual explicit effort by a number of countries, to have a super short, super minimalist transparency section, which basically would say, we agree to establish a new transparency system, details next year. Because we wanted the moment when we were in the spotlight to be able to say, no, it's got to be this kind with these basic parameters. And then you can spell it out more, but you don't allow the people who are sort of more recalcitrant to push it off into a year where there would be less focus, and where many of them would try if there hadn't been enough texture to say, well, but this is still developed countries do this and developing countries do that, and so forth. So we got what we needed and then some, I think, in terms of spelling out enough detail, but it's still not you'll still need to do more than that. So there'll be guidelines that will need to get negotiated there and in other areas, and those will be important, and it'll be important to make sure that the world is still watching, and that NGOs and others are making clear and making sure that the press aren't looking the other way, because that's where people who are trying to pull back will try to do their work. Did I just go off? No,
Yeah,
I'm
now
not.
you're
Okay.
back.
It's at some level, so there'll be some number of areas in the international negotiations where we will need to do further work, and we are actually just, I mean, my team is not even back yet, but we all know that the next step will be to kind of map out exactly what those areas are, and then what the plan is to carry them forward. But it's also true that there'll be a tremendous amount of what needs to happen now that needs to happen at national levels, or in cooperative levels between, whether it's bilaterally or in some plurilateral configurations. But the name of the game now is that countries have to take the steps, which are almost always at a national level, to meet the targets that they put forward. There's, I think, a ton of work to do with developing countries to help them develop the sort of enabling environments that can attract investment. That tends to be, when you talk about finance in these overly politicized negotiations, you tend to get the response often that we don't want to talk about the private sector, you owe us, it's your fault, you blah, blah, blah. And obviously there needs to be substantial public money, and if you look at there was an actual process that was gone through this year to see how far we've gone. Where are we in the course of getting to that $100 billion commitment that goes all the way back to Copenhagen to mobilize $100 billion for developing countries by 2020 from all developed countries. And the OECD did a study and showed that we were at about somewhere between 62, 65 billion per year through 2014. And about 3/4 of that is public money. So it's not the case that the public money isn't happening, but it is the case that, so to sort of step back, what all of this is about, everything we've been talking about is transforming the global economy to low carbon. I mean, that's what this game is. That's the only way we actually combat climate change. And so the steps that need to be taken to make that possible are key, and the capacity to get private sector finance flowing around the world is critical, and that requires the right kind of investment environments in countries around the world. And you can see countries that are doing it, even sometimes really surprising ones. I mean, Nicaragua, of all places, totally hard line in the negotiations, by the way, including in those last minutes that we talked about earlier. They have gone, I don't have the exact numbers in my head right now, but from somewhere in the range of 20 to almost 50% renewable energy in about 5 years. And they've attracted, it's a small country, but they've attracted, I forget exactly, but somewhere between $1.5 billion and $2 billion of private investment. And they've done it because they made certain regulatory and legal changes very deliberately. They were paying way too much for energy. They did rely a lot on diesel and very expensive stuff. And they've got religion now, and they're going just completely whole hog. Malaysia is doing well. Philippines are doing well. Morocco's doing well. And it can be because you put in a feed-in tariff, because you You put in changes that make it possible for countries, for investors, to actually depend on the power purchase agreement that's part of the facility that's built. And that's what, but there's a zillion countries where that's not true. So it's going to be really important, if you think about, the sort of clean energy transformation that needs to happen, to do those things. It's going to be very important to drive assistance for adaptation in countries that are really poor. It's going to be, I think that the initiative that Prime Minister Modi called, I don't love the name, but I love the fact that he named it, Mission Innovation, was a really, really good idea that we worked on with the French and the Indians, and was in which Bill Gates had a very important role. But it's premised on all countries, getting as many countries. We ended up with 20, which is pretty extraordinary since the whole thing, start to finish, was less than 3 months. To agree to double their investment in R&D, energy R&D, clean energy R&D within 5 years, with Gates having rounded up, I think, about 25 of his multi-billionaire investor friends to agree to invest in the output of that kind of R&D. I think that's hugely important, because we have tons of cleaner energy alternatives. Then, well, to some extent we're using them, but we have a lot more that we can do with what exists. But we don't have it. But what exists is not enough to actually, lick this problem. I mean, we need still transformational discoveries and inventions, and that happens through doing really serious basic research and having investors ready to get discoveries over the various death valleys that make it hard to go from discovery to commercialization. So I think I was really very excited about this development, but there will need to be more activities like that. I mean, it's sort of like the game is on now. We have created a framework for international action that's going to last, that is going to ratchet up every 5 years, that has a structure for what countries are supposed to do in terms of mitigation and transparency and financial support and all of that. That's now, for the first time ever, established, and now it's game on. Now everybody's got to go and under the banner of this, under this structure, take action. So.
We have a few more minutes here before Todd will have to leave and start playing that game. And I'd love to be able to take a couple of questions from the audience, if you don't mind. If you could please just announce your name and your organization affiliation. Please, gentlemen here in the front with the tie.
Walt Minnick, Partnership for Responsible Growth. There's no question that what you have negotiated is an extraordinary achievement. There's also, though, talk that even if every country achieves the targets, nobody falls, it's on time, we're still only getting halfway to where we need to be. And probably less than halfway if we're really shooting for 1.5 degrees as opposed to 2-degree increase. What do you think the impact would be internationally if we were able, in the United States, in the next Congress, to enact a revenue-neutral fee on carbon emissions, and couple that with a border tax adjustment tariff to give other countries the economic self-interested incentive to do the same thing? Would that get us where we need to be post-Paris?
So thanks for the question. I guess let me say a couple of things. First of all, you're right that these INDCs don't get us all the way there, and nobody in their wildest dreams thought they would. I would note the study by Climate Action Tracker, which is a very good analytic body analyzing sort of the trajectory that we're on. A year ago, they projected, based on the policies that existed, that we were on a path to 3.6. October 1st this year, they revised that to 2.7. So a long way from 2 and an even longer way from 1.5, but also a long way from 3.6 in 1 year. So that, I think, I tend to see that glass a little bit more half full than half empty, but I think that's very important. Look, pricing carbon is a big, 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 big deal, and we sort of have implicit prices on carbon. Obviously, the president tried to get a real price on carbon back in with regard to the cap and trade legislation, but that, you know, someday that's going to happen. One hopes it will happen sooner rather than later. The president has done what I think, by any assessment, has been an absolutely amazing job of driving forward change in this country on the basis of legislation that already exists in the power sector, the vehicle sector, buildings, and so forth. But you can do more if you have Congress. So I think that's my guess is that's something in our future. And again, the sooner the future can come, the better. Border adjustment, I mean, that's a whole nother issue, and that might be, you know, I don't want to kind of jump into that one. I think it's what you'd rather see ideally is a world in which there was carbon pricing taking place all over. The Chinese are getting close to putting in a national cap and trade program. Whether it's priced at the right level or not probably won't be right away, but again, if they get the structure, that could be a start. I think that kind of thing probably will be important. But you know, the other thing that is going to be, we need to get ourselves, and I think it's already happening, but we need to get ourselves into a kind of virtuous circle where more action begets more action, and at the point where we're definitely not there yet, but at the point where the straight economic case says you're better off going with clean energy than the alternative, then things can happen very, very quickly. I mean, you didn't need legislation for computers to make Selectric, IBM Selectrics obsolete. It's because it was a better, cheaper alternative. So.
Great. We have time for one more question. Gentleman in the far back there with the yes.
Thanks. I'm Kirk Renault with Common Sense Solar, and I have a different kind of question. It's really about psychology, and I can't get agreement around my own dinner table, and I am amazed that you could get 195 countries to agree on what day it is, much less something as complicated as this. And I wonder if you had any explicit work on that. Did you have a team of psychologists working for you to make people more constructive and cooperative, or was it the French wine, or any tips for me?
No, we did not have a team of psychologists. We had occasional French wine, but so it's actually never the case that you get everybody to agree with you. What you get is, and there were, these are very contentious negotiations. They always are. The sense at the very end of everybody like feeling pretty positive about it was striking, to be sure. But what you're doing is trying to build enough, find the landing zones, socialize those with enough important players. Recognize that everybody's going to be unhappy to some extent, and you're trying to get the unhappiness limited enough or leavened enough by places in the agreement where they can be a little bit happy that nobody's ready to jump off a bridge. I mean, that's kind of what you're not. There's never a kumbaya moment in negotiations like this, except maybe when the gavel comes down and everybody is relieved and pleased that that something's happening. I will say, even for the toughest nuts to crack, there seemed to be a lot of smiles at the end. So that was interesting and satisfying. But I should spend some time trying to, if I get some time off one of these days, to sort of think about how it all comes together. But it's a matter of countries evaluating their national interests in a pretty hard-headed way. And you also have the phenomenon, I suppose, I mean, there's different negotiating styles. We do not tend to be this way, and I think generally developed countries, for whatever reason, don't tend to be this way. And it's, I don't mean to say, to paint with a broad brush and say all developing countries are, but you definitely have some dynamic of a style where countries ask for the moon knowing they're going to get a lot less. And so when they don't get the moon, they're not actually that disappointed because they didn't think they were. There's just a lot of patient work that goes bit by bit, and then trying to put a package together where, as I say, nobody is so unhappy that they're prepared to block it.
Thanks. And the Paris Agreement, I don't know if you got the moon, but you got something that was historic and would not have happened but for your 7 years of relentless day in, night in work. So thank you so much for coming here today. Thank you everyone here for joining us. And we look forward to keeping the fight going.
Okay,
Thanks.